Hello everyone, today we talk about the Alans, Latin the Alani, an ancient and medieval Iranian nomadic pastoral people of the North Caucasus that we mentioned often in our videos about the migration era, that I intentioned this video to be part of the series of made of all the various peoples, this being actually the first Iranic one. Right, and we mention them often, in fact, as part of these broader, in fact, Iranic populations of the steppes that were overwhelmed at some point by the Germanic and the Hunnish migration, and that fundamentally poured mostly westwards into Europe, reviving also that military equestrian culture of the steppes that the same Europeans essentially has stemmed from, and that we're still reminiscent of, and that is also at the base of the of our knighthood, right? Of chivalry, of all a set of values and training and techniques and codes, etc. that were to revive on this essentially aristocratic base, right? The elites that ruled this populations on the march, that, as you know, had a greater unity of command than the sedentary tribes for different reasons that we explained elsewhere. So they really deserve attention, as in particular the Alans had this post, let's say, from a Western perspective, migration era, but from their own perspective, like a permanent migration era, considering more or less their movements in the steppes. Yes, they sedentarized, as we'll see in the kingdom of Alania, at the Caucasian foothills, having during the High Middle Ages this important dominion that also had an important role in the relations in the Byzantine Arab wars with the Khazars, even with the Rus, and that perhaps we'll speak better about another time on, because it's we don't know excessively much about that, but still it's one of those areas that you really want to look at in detail, their military organization, influences, etc. And the Alans are generally regarded as part of the Sarmatians, but let's say that these ethnic subdivisions are a bit classicistic. I mean, they were, like many others, fundamentally formulated by the great Mediterranean civilizations, and they do not reflect the fluidity of this world at many levels. When in the steppes, it's kind of the most obvious reality, as we will see. They emerged essentially from the easternmost branch of the Indo-European peoples, thus from Central Asia. So much that were documented not just by the Greeks, the Romans, but also by the Chinese and many other peoples later on. And so they, as we'll see, they migrated largely, not entirely. Right? This is typical of migration era peoples, that somebody remains always back and also moves, as we will see, in different areas around, aside from the longer migrations. And they migrated westwards, becoming dominant among the Sarmatians on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, right? And they are mentioned by Roman sources since the 1st century AD. At that time, the region north of the Black Sea was frequently, it was quite active, right? It saw the launching of many raids deep into outer territories. Had been actually since millennia, right? The Scythians, the populations, and were always poured into Mesopotamia at some point. The same Achaemenids, the same Parthians were fundamentally Scythian peoples, and even if the definitions can vary, but that's always the same old story of this nomadic populations pouring at different waves continuously into the surrounding continents. And in the West, we have to recover this idea, because not just as Europeans we properly stem in great part from those movements, but properly these things never quite ended. Like from a narrower Western European perspective, we say, okay, now that's the sedentary era, more or less like that, but move a few 100 kilometers east, you see that was the norm right? Also for lots of peoples that were sedentary but had to suffer the waves of all these populations. And the story goes on. It's very complex, actually, as we will see. In Roman times, they in fact invested the Middle East. They actually harassed the Parthian Empire, the Caucasian provinces of Rome. And from the beginning of the first half of the 3rd century AD, the Goths, however, broke the Alan power on the Pontic steppe, right? And we don't know much about that, but as we will see, there was fundamentally a merging between the two cultures that also conferred, in fact, to the Goths the most advanced equestrian culture among the Germanic peoples, probably not changing them radically, as it's somewhat believed. We have to make videos about this at some point, but still meaningful enough to be regarded the best, the most, let's say, organized, the most, at least, military effective of the Germanic population, so much that the Huns also regarded them greatly, but also having subjugated them, together with the help, as we will see, of the same Alans that went a bit back and forth. And upon, in fact, the Hunnic defeat of the Goths in the Pontic steppe, and we are around 375 AD, many of the Alans migrated westwards, right, alongside with the Huns and these other Germanic tribes. They crossed the Rhine in famous, the fatidic 406 AD, together with the Vandals and the Suebi, and they settled in Orléans, right, in Valence. And from this area, as we'll see, they controlled an important set, especially northern Gallic politics, checking also the Franks, etc. And around 409, they joined the Vandals and the Suebi, however, in crossing the Pyrenees into the rich Iberian Peninsula, right? And they settled in Lusitania and in the Hispania Cartaginensis. The region was, however, stable and crowded, so much that the Alans were defeated by the Visigoths in 418 AD, and they subsequently surrendered their authority to the Asdingi Vandals, and together with them in 428 they in fact would cross the Gibraltar Strait into North Africa, where they founded a powerful kingdom, the Vandalic one, which lasted until its conquest by the forces of the Roman Emperor Justinian I in 534 AD. We made a video about the Vandals as well, but we'll keep talking about them. We didn't do it very often, but that they're often overlooked as well. In all this, that there were other groups, as we've seen, of Alans that had remained behind, right, and that remained specifically under Hunnic rule, founding eventually the powerful kingdom of Alania in the north of Caucasus. Much later on, because of many movements that were happening in the area, this around the 9th century AD. And this entity, albeit contained geographically, but still, as we've seen, important for tipping the balance of the powers around, survived until the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. And there is a general perception that, supported by many Ossetian scholars, that the Alans would be essentially the ancestors of the modern Ossetians. As we will see, there is some base of truth to this, but always bear in mind that we better talk of essentially Alanized Caucasian peoples that were still pre-existing in the area, and still the Alans, as you understand in their ethnogenesis, were probably also quite mixed on their own. The Alans, as we will see, also spoke an Eastern Iranian language that derived from the Scytho-Sarmatian branch, which in turn evolved into the modern Ossetian language. And the name of Alan represents the, let's say, an Iranian dialectal form of Aryan, so the noble, of the Arya people, etc., which the Alans represent a bit the top. If you look in continuity, I can't think of a single Aryan people that lasted that long properly as in continuity of its ethnic identity, right? And so much that they are very interesting to be studied, because they left a mark a bit in a very wide area of Eurasia. So today we will make essentially a short excursus on the main phases of Alan history. Eventually we will make more in-depth videos, but this is just to give an idea overall of what fundamentally they managed to achieve and how far and wide they affected Eurasian populations. Now, the Alans, as we were saying before, were documented by foreign observers from the 1st century AD under similar names. So Latin Alani, Greek Alanoi, the Chinese Alandial, and in the 2nd century, Alan in the 3rd century again, and Alanguo. Right, then the Parthian and Middle Persian language we call them Alanan, which is a plural. In Arab it would be Alan at singular. In Syriac Alania. In classical Armenian Alang, Georgian Alaneti. It stands for the country of the Alans. In Hebrew Alan, plural Alanim. And there are other versions naturally in the sources. For example, you have Latin spellings including Alauni or Halani with the H before the A. And the name was also preserved in the modern Ossetian language as Alon. And there is more to that. Now, the ethnonym Alan is, as we were saying before, a dialectal variant of the Old Iranian Aryana, right? That derived from the root Arya, meaning Aryan. The common self-designation of the Indo-Iranian peoples, and this probably came in use in the early history of the Alans for the purpose of uniting an heterogeneous group of tribes through the invocation of a common ancestral, let's say, Aryan origin. Naturally, in the steppes, this is very, first of all, we can't track what happened concretely, but the same name Aryan by itself, meaning the noble ones, is a vague terminology. Was naturally, it's typical of the steppe. I mean, it's the idea that the best, the elite, the aristoi, right, joined together into, and that the common characteristic is such nobility, and that's where also why we talk so much about these peoples also in the genesis of European chivalry, etc. Because there is properly an elite, an aristocratic ethos to such code of values, etc., together with cavalry, with the idea properly of being so rich and powerful and wealthy to be a nobleman, right? And naturally, there were lots of other peoples after them that in the steppes they're mostly clients peoples, that is subjected people, and hence that ferocious say Aryan aspect that we see also, I don't know, in Vedic India, the idea of properly the rulers are a different caste, even racially, from the rest of the population, and much of such divides lived on. For example, in the Roman, in the Germanic aristocracy, is properly the idea that the noble is something, that people is something else, right? And this goes along with other aspects of religion that we will look at some point. So, like the name of Iran, Aryanam, the adjective Aryana appears to be related to Aryanem Vayu, that is stretch of the Aryas, that is essentially this mythical homeland of the early Iranians mentioned in the Avesta that we don't quite understand where, that means highly debated where it could have been, but that gave the name to these people. There are some derivatives that brought to ethnonyms, such as the Roxolani, that means the bright Alans, right? And this was an offshoot of the same Alans, whose name may be linked to religious practices. Also, the Alanorsoi, the white Alans, that there was perhaps a conglomerate of Alans and the Aorsi that were an Akin people, as we'll see now. And the same personal name Alan or Alen stems, in European history from the Latin Alanus, which may have been properly introduced by Alan settlers in Western Europe during the first millennium AD, as we will see now, as the Romans fundamentally settled them as federati largely in the western provinces. The Alans were also known over the course of their history by another group of related names, including the variations Asi, As, and Os, so that there are many correspondences. For example, the Romanian Yazi, as we'll see also, the city might have been actually founded by the Alans themselves, or Orlani. Bulgarian Uzi, Hungarian Yash, Russian Yazi, and Georgian, and I can't read here the Georgian alphabet, so sorry, but it's something very similar. And it is the name of the root of the modern Ossetian as well. So that's good, the connection. So there is all a timeline here to understand, which we'll try to look at more concretely. So speaking of the early Alans, right? So the first mentions of names that historians link with the Alani, which is different from the term itself, appear almost at the same time, interestingly enough, in texts from the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and China. In 1st century AD was the moment in which the Alans migrated westwards from Central Asia, right? That is a deep political and strategical idea. I mean, the fact that these peoples emerged properly from this position, managing to control east and west in a universalistic sense, its trade routes, the idea of, it's like also the biceps eagle, that the looking east and west, it also was, acquired. Think about the Seljuks or the Byzantine Empire, the symbology, the same Habsburgs later on. I mean, this is where great part of that same, as we've seen, political and military ethos of Europe also stems from at the roots, right? As the first in the part of Indo-Europeans had brought these things in the old continent, and at this point the Alans arrived. So the tendency, more or less, with the history of the Scythians, of the Sarmatians, etc., is that those who came from the east, that is from the cauldron of the steppe, that was the most pressured, the most, the hardest, because everything was more unstable, and therefore these peoples were more warlike, would fundamentally come at waves, overwhelming, subduing those peoples that had gone westwards and kind of, more sedentarized, softened up by a certain degree. It's like with the Scythians and the Sarmatians, they were essentially the same peoples at the root. It doesn't make any sense to try to distinguish them categorically. The important is that at which time they arrived and which time they took for them to open to civilization, to become more sedentary, more civil, if you want, but less warlike. So the Alans are a bit, as you see in the classical sources, a bit the top military thing. Like, if you had to think that the best cavalrymen, the famous kind of fish scale looking armor, this also great metallurgic skills that were all connected with their religion, the shamanic trance of the rite of passage of the warrior of the youth into manhood and warriorhood, the connection with the horse, the drums, the coordination of the art. This is something all that actually survived among the Western Europeans. Like, I mean, the Romans, we've seen it with the Germans. They all remembered somewhere in their foggy mythology that at the root it was something like that. They had maintained that ethos, even though they had not quite rationalized, they were transformed, etc. And they were hell of fighters, indeed. That this is the main characteristic of this population. And they were able to subdue, fundamentally, the major... they settled between the Don River and the Caspian Sea, and from there they achieved this dominant position among the Sarmatians, that also were pretty, considered pretty warlike by Western standards as well. The Alans are mentioned in the Vologases inscription, which reads that Vologases, that is essentially the Parthian king between around 45 and 700 AD, in the 11th year of his reign, that is therefore 62 AD, battled Kuluk, who was king of the Alan, because the Parthians were dealing essentially, their core lands were the Iranian plateau, right? And they had come from the north, from these steppe populations themselves. They dealt with the Romans in the west, in Mesopotamia, in the Caucasus, etc., in the Near East, but in the north, not just from the Caucasus, but properly from the north of the Iranian plateau, the Caspian Sea, RLC, those areas that were fundamentally without a border. They were semi-feudal areas. They were not part of great sedentary civilizations with infrastructures, cities. So it was fundamentally based on their Sassets played a bit, by settling, in fact, these peoples and using them also for for hiring this fresh new force, etc. But they had to fight with them as well. And in the 1st century AD, the Jewish historian Josephus supplements this inscription. In fact, Josephus reports in the Jewish Wars 774 how Alans, whom he calls a Scythian tribe, the Scutai, are a bit indifferently all these peoples that live north, like in the steppes, etc., and that have this custom of life, living near the Sea of Azov, crossed the Iron Gates for plunder in 72 AD and defeated the armies of Pacorus, that was at the time the king of Media, and Tiridates, king of Armenia, 2 brothers of Vologeses I as well, for whom the above-mentioned inscription in fact was made. And we can read this passage from Josephus. It says, "Now there was a nation of the Alans, which we have formerly mentioned somewhere as being Scythians, and living around Tanais and Lake Maiotis." So that's the Azov Sea. And this nation, about this time, laid a design of falling upon Media and departs beyond it in order to plunder them, with which intention they treated with the king of Hyrcania. For he was master of that passage which King Alexander shut up with iron gates. This king gave them leave to come through them. So they came in great multitudes and fell upon the Medes unexpectedly and plundered their country, which they found full of people and replenished with abundance of cattle, while nobody dared make any resistance against them. For Pacorus, the king of the country, had fled away for fear in 2 places where they could not easily come at him, and had yielded up everything he had to them, and had only saved his wife and his concubines from them, and that with difficulty also, after they had been made captives, by giving 100 talents for their ransom. These Alans therefore plundered the country with opposition and with great ease, and proceeded as far as Armenia, laying waste all before them. Now Tiridates was king of that country, who met them and fought them, but was lucky not to have been taken alive in the battle. For a certain man threw a noose over him, and would soon have drawn him in, had he not immediately cut the cord with his sword and escaped. So the Alans, being still more provoked by this sight, laid waste the country and drove a great multitude of men, and a great quantity of the other booty from both kingdoms along with them, and then retreated back to their own country. So this is a pretty eloquent and accurate description of what these peoples were fundamentally about. Plundering, stealing cattle, slave trading, and fundamentally living off of these resources and going on like that, right? Like laying waste, fundamentally, whatever they found in front of them. This is a really interesting reference of this sword was like kind of lasso-like thrown at the king of Armenia to be taken, as also, used to do like exhausted heavy cavalry, usually to take down from horses and capturing them. And that is very common in the steppes, etc., among these horse-riding peoples. And the fact that the Alans invaded Parthia through Hyrcania shows that at the time many Alans were still based northeast of the Caspian Sea. Right, they moved over time. They didn't inhabit the same land, so they were roughly around between the Caspian and the Aral Sea, right, as we were saying before. And by the early 2nd century AD, the Alans, however, were in firm control of another area, the one of the lower Volga and Kuban. So, an area that they would, south of it, fundamentally would be the core land, eventually, of their later kingdom. Here now they were more extended, right? Consider that at this point in history it's the Iranians that dominate the steppes, it's the Indo-Europeans. Eventually it's the Turks that take the upper hand. We will see it also with all the troubles with the Khazars, etc. And these lands had been earlier occupied by the Aorsi and the Syrakus, that were Achaean people, to the Sarmatians, and the Alans absorbed them and dispersed or destroyed them. Right, it was normal, as we've seen, to fundamentally integrate new groups to fill the ranks, etc., and to employ them to as mass, etc. But fundamentally, these tribes do not figure as any longer in contemporary accounts. So, in a way or another, they cease to be kind of to have an autonomous, independent identity when they were absorbed by these peoples. And it's likely that the Alans' influence stretched also further westwards, right, encompassing most of the Sarmatian world, that at that point also had a relatively homogeneous culture, and therefore we can't really understand even archaeologically exactly who was who or to which extent certain domination stretched like. Right? Now, famously enough, for literary reasons, and studied the Roman army, in 135 AD, the Alans made a huge raid into Asia Minor via the Caucasus, ravaging Median Armenia, and at this point they were eventually driven back by the Romans, commanded by Arian, the governor of Cappadocia, who wrote a very detailed report that is the major source for studying Roman military tactics, that is in fact the Ektaxis Kata Alanon, that is in Greek the war against the Alans, that shows all that very interesting, we will make a video about that, essentially a raid that was very much in depth, so to withstand probably the ferocious heavy cavalry charges of these people that literally had the finest heavily armored cavalry of the time, and had a dramatic collective training that made them excellent for this shock tactics, and the Romans mostly adopted these different lines in depth, kind of bogging them down with fire, with arrows, etc., and javelins, and trying to absorb the shock. Now, from 215 to 250 AD, as we were saying before, the Germanic Goths expanded southeastwards and broke the Alan dominance of the Pontic steppe. We made videos about the Goths, and specifically the mostly, like, we can't call them the Ostrogoths because they were differently, let's say, but they most of what they would become later. In fact, the most mixed with the Sarmatians themselves and with the Huns. And in fact, the Alans in particular seem to have had a significant influence of the culture of the Goths. We became excellent horsemen and adopted the Alanic animal style art. Remember that in the ancient world there is properly never anything like a genocide. Genocide doesn't mean killing a lot of people. Genocide means to wipe out a specific group because you want to cancel it from the face of the earth, right, based on a specific identity or of some sort. Such things didn't exist. Not even the Romans killing hundreds of thousands of Gauls had anything to do with genocide. The same goes for the Jewish wars, etc. And when we see these peoples kind of disappearing by a certain standard, you always have to think that what happened there was just blended together, right? And they acquired kind of a different identity where you can easily see the survival of the previous one also. And at this point, the Goths, as you know, had established a florid kingdom in what is roughly today's Ukraine, dominating the great Russian rivers and opening to the Black Sea, from which they raided through piracy the Roman Empire, causing chaos right during the 3rd century crisis. The Goths would attack also along the Danubian front, famously enough, because there were different groups. Others properly but speaking about the eastern ones, right? They and we can't think that the Alans were mixed in all these groups, as far as we understand, right? They, as mobile, as fluid as they were, all the Gothic armies with their heavy cavalry met by the Illyrian emperors that also adapted to such equestrian culture, but for reasons also that exceed just the contact with these peoples just by itself, but that contributed to expand the equestrian culture in the Roman army itself, also because lots of these peoples now were properly taken into the Roman army themselves and settling in the empire and becoming Romans, and with all their Rome had at this point absolutely all the absorbing capacity of any kind of technique, technology, etc., to replicate partially this the same tactics. The Goths were defeated by Gallienus, by Claudius II, by Aurelian. So at this point, really nothing that the Roman army couldn't meet on the field. But still, the influence received from the East is very important. It owes a lot to this properly Sarmato-Germanic military culture, as it's right to call properly the Eastern Gothic one the most, right? For other Germans, it's relatively different. For the Eastern ones in general, yes, but it's also probably been like it wasn't just about the Germans, it was about the entire world at this point. For many reasons, was turning more equestrian in some way, and more, let's say, militarily functionalized, because of reasons now they're a bit philosophical, we can't quite explain, if not by digressing excessively. Now, after the Gothic entry into the steppe, many of the Alans seem to have retreated eastwards, towards the Don River. So it's kind of obvious, like the Germans were descending from the from the great rivers from the northwest, fundamentally towards the southeast. So the Sarmatians squeezed toward the east, right, not towards the north, because they weren't peopleable lands, right, but the Don towards the Caucasus, etc. That was where, as we've seen in part, they had already established their settlement, and also where they came into contact for the first time with the Huns, right? So much that Ammianus writes that the Alans were, quote, somewhat like the Huns, but in their manner of life and their habits they were less savage. Jordanus contrasted them with the Huns, noting that the Alans, quote, were their equals in battle, but unlike them in their civilization, manners, and appearance. Right? In the late 4th century, Vegetius conflates Alans and Huns in his military treatise Hunnorum Alanorum Quenatio, so properly the nation of the Huns and the Alans, and collocates the Goths, Huns, and Alans, exemplo Gothorum et Alanorum Unnorumque. So this is important for a number of reasons. First one, from a strictly military point of view. Now, the Huns are generally overrated in a broader, considering the ego that they had in European historiography since Roman times, etc. And it's fascinating. The same Romanized authors would fundamentally consider the Alans at the same level, military quality of the Huns themselves. And this is part of that broader homogeneity that existed among steppes peoples, right? But it's also interesting that the Romans themselves would consider the Alans as more civilized, in a sense, right? They were less savage than the Huns. It's kind of obvious, like having lived hundreds of years so close at the outskirts of the Roman Empire, of Hellenistic civilization, etc. They had gentrified by some margin. They had become richer, wealthier, properly materially, but still maintaining their warlikeness and structuring their military in an area that was rich, like the Ukraine. You can think all about the grain, also the trade along the Black Sea. I mean, those are not dramatically prosper areas. A few tens of kilometers interland is literally the barbaricum, the badly made, right? The steppes and etc. But still, it's an area that, the temperate steppes where you can fundamentally develop such huge, blocks, and that if they can milk a cow, like an empire that has troubles to maintain its frontiers, and you can pillage and raid into it. You can accumulate wealth. You can organize peoples. This is important also because over time these populations of the steppes had also kind of hierarchized more than they had done in the past. Right? There is properly a process of political compaction aside from these main upheavals, as we'll see now, that also broke a lot of things, and then eventually the crisis of the late late antiquity that struck the steppes as well, in a sense, and this speaks naturally for the high military quality of the Alans that surely deserved such such evaluation. Now I think, yes, that's all I wanted to say. Then the 4th century Roman historian Ammianus noted also that the Alans were, quote, formerly called Massagetai, actually, or Massagetai, if you want the classical pronunciation. In fact, Dio Cassius wrote even that the Alans were Massaget, right? And it is likely that the Alans were an amalgamation of various Iranian peoples, right? The Massagetai were a bit eastwards, right? And these would include Sarmatians, Massagetai, and Sakas. And again, the differentiation are relatively loose, right? The Sakas are broadly meant, and they're difficult to properly trace a boundary between them. And scholars have connected the Alans to the nomadic state of Yankai that is mentioned in Chinese sources, And this was fundamentally an ancient nomadic state centered near the Aral Sea. So very westwards from a Chinese perspective. We are in Han times, so also the peak of Chinese civilization, parallel to the Roman Empire at this time. And the Yankai are first mentioned in connection with the late 2nd century BC, actually. Diplomat Zhang Qian travels in chapter 123 of the Shiji, I think it's pronounced, whose author Sima Qian died around 90 BC. And the Yankai of Chinese records has again been equated with the Aorsi. It was a powerful Sarmatian tribe, as we've seen, living between the Don River and the Aral Sea before the arrival of the Alans mentioned in Roman records, in particular Strabo. Now, there are some linguistic connections that have been attempted to be drawn to link essentially the Yankai to the Alans, etc., etc. So the later Han Dynasty Chinese chronicle, the Hu Hanshu 88. So this was completed in the 5th century, and it talked essentially of the period 1st to 3rd century AD, roughly. Mentioned our report that the Yankai nation, which means literally, Yankai means the vast steppes, extensive grassland, right? And this is to be compared with the Latin Abzoi, right? Identified with the Aorsi, ancient Greek Aorsioi, right? That had become a vassal state of the Kangyu, right? That were this Sogdianian power, was now known as Alan Liao, right? And some scholars suggest that the Kangyu subjugation of Yankai occurred somewhere between the 1st century BC, and that this subjugation was caused different Sarmatian tribes, including the Aorsi, to migrate westwards, which played a major role in, triggering in part all those domino effects that eventually would escalate further during the migration era. In the 3rd century, Veilue, that is a Chinese historical text written by Yuan between, essentially during the mid 3rd century, and also notes that the Yankai was then known to be Alans, although they were no longer vassal of the Kangyu, because as we've seen at this point, they had, freed themselves, not just by moving westwards, but also in the original era of Central Asia. So scholars debated this question. Some believed that the Yankai with the could be the same Aorsoi mentioned by Strabo, right? And this would be based on the identification of the name Alan that explained by Ptolemy's Alanorsi, right? Others do not like this, and everything is naturally very vague in a sense. And however, aside from these aspects, what we know best about the Alans is definitely what comes into contact with the West, right? And around 370 AD, according to Ammianus, the peaceful relations between the Alans and the Huns were broken. After the Huns attacked the Don Alans, killing many of them and establishing an alliance with the survivors. So this basically means that the Alans fell under the Hunnic domination, and with them, in fact, in 375, successfully invaded the Goths, right, and accompanied the same Huns in their westward expansion in Europe. Now, following the Hunnic invasion in 370, other Alans, however, along with other Sarmatians, migrated westwards to escape the Hunnic domination. So, essentially falling, as we will see, into the Western and properly the Roman domination, because it's a bit the history of the Germans themselves. They were either with the Romans or with the Huns, right? There was no other choice at this point. So the Alans did the same, and one of these Alan groups fought together with the Goths in the decisive Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. In fact, the Visigoths are, as they are, that's a later term. We made videos about the Visigoths, but they had, especially in their cavalry, these powerful allies among the Ostrogoths, the Alans, and at that point you could even suggest there wouldn't be excessive difference, as we were saying before. So basically, the most important battle of late antiquity, at least for the long non-teleological consequences that it had with the death of Emperor Valens, etc. And I'd say nothing that actually disproves the value of the Roman army that actually existed in spite of the collapse of its chain of command, on the field against the continued attacks of the enemy, even surrounded, etc. So we're talking about very harsh struggles between, let's say, peoples that were at this point pretty aware of one another from a time, were more consistently, blending in properly in terms of military culture by the greatest hybridizer of all, that is war itself. And the Alans in this process, went, passed across. Here we have to think they're not just like an entire people, right? As we've seen, there were different groups, and just like for the Germans, some of them were literally just some war bands, right? Some were consistent. Some fought for the Romans, others joined the Huns, the Visigoths, or Ostrogoths. So this would place them all in different realities, because if they simply were Roman federati, they would be settled somewhere, being under Roman administration. Then under the Huns, simply remaining out there in the barbaric and participating to the Hunnic lordship, etc. The Visigoths and the would essentially enter the Roman Empire, but being essentially a non-digestible people that wasn't broken down, it was settled by the Romans later on, and the Ostrogoths also being under the Huns but having these groups. So it's that varied, is as varied as it gets. So a portion of the Western Alans also joined the Vandals and the Suebi from Central Europe for their invasion of Roman Gaul, right? And that's when Gregory of Tours actually mentions in his Liber Historiae Francorum that the Alan king Respendial saved the day for the Vandals in an armed encounter with the Franks at the famous crossing of the Rhine, allegedly on December the 31st, 406, on the frozen river. And it's interesting that the Franks that were Roman federati at that point stood their ground, because those were fundamentally the lands they had received from Rome, and they tried to stamp it, but famously enough they wouldn't, and this avalanche would swarm into Gaul, into Spain and Africa, as we were saying. We will see now again, but still it's meaningful that fundamentally it was the Alans that saved, that rendered that possible. Right, so from the top of their military culture for the Vandals and other Germanic peoples that were not as, let's say, properly cohesive as them, properly also as collectively trained, how strong their cavalry, etc., like them. We made videos about this. We explained more or less also what the difficulties of some peoples were, and the steppes peoples have been called shepherds of peoples, actually, because properly gives the dimension of how strong. You see, if the sources equated the Alans to the Huns, in a way they equate them also in the prestige, in the greatness, in the capacity of subjugating other peoples, as we've seen, even though they had actually surrendered to the gods, etc. But they participated to this broader leading capacity that was derived, and the resilience of the Alans is remarkable in this regard, because, for example, most Germanic peoples, once they got crushed in an important defeat, etc., they wouldn't recover anymore. Think about the Burgundians. Think about also how the Justinian reconquest happened. Right, they would disappear for some reason, at least as an independent people, right, and the single people living on, but or being deported or going, some were killed, of course, as well. But the Alans seemingly continually regenerated, in a sense, and this speaks for a dramatic, probably survival capacity that was connected to that myth grinder that the steppe had been. It was very different from, let's say, what the sedentary European tribes were used to. Were much looser, much less cohesive from a political point of view. So a great quality properly of the Alans from a political, hence military and social point of view. And according also to Gregory of Tours, another group of Alans, led by Goar, crossed the Rhine at the same time, and however immediately joined the Romans faithfully, right, and being settled by the same in Gaul. Because at the end of the day, these people's dream was always what? Sedentarizing. Like they wanted the rich pastures, the rich land, etc. So that was the dream of the steppe, right? Meeting these great sedentary civilizations, mostly they hadn't been able to break through, and now it was happening, and the Romans would grant them the part of Gaul that was thoroughly a rich Romanized area, etc. Others would want even more than that. Now, under Beorgor, that is named by the sources Beorgor Rex Alanorum. Here, you know that in Latin Rex is just, it's not there is no article, but it's not the Rex. It can be a king, right? So one of the kings of the Alans, because these were all different chieftains, right, tribes, etc. And who knows also who they were, because they had some tribal identity that, aside from the broader group, that was somewhat very, very strong for the clans that made it up. And this group moved throughout Gaul till the reign of Petronius Maximus. So these we are in the mid-5th century, right? And when they crossed the Alps in the winter 464 into Liguria, into Italy, but they were defeated and Berger slain by Ricimer, commander of the emperor's forces. Now, naturally, there were these various bands kind of penetrating, trying to settle, to raid, but still at that point, even at the very end of Roman capacity of administration, etc., in the west, they could be stopped, they could be defeated. Now, in 442, after it became clear to Aetius that he could not longer rely upon the Huns for support, because initially, everything was very pragmatically dealt with, where he turned to the aforementioned Alan king Goar, persuading him to move some of his people to settlements in the Orléanais. So these were fundamentally the Alans that were passed without permission, right? But they also accepted fundamentally to cooperate with the Romans. They received the area around Orléans that was quite important strategically, and as you know, it's the heart of Gaul, right? And the heart of France, even historically later on. And this is not random, because from there they could control, in fact, the Bacaudae of Armorica, and especially to stem on the Loire the Visigoths, right, from expanding their territories northward from Aquitaine across the river Loire. A very strategical, because northeast they had the Franks, east they had the Alemanni, south they had the Burgundians. So it was quite a position. They're quite central. Properly from there they could kind of dominate the whole surrounding. That's why Aetius probably chose the Alans, because they were powerful enough. And Goar settled, in fact, a substantial number of his followers in the Orléanais and the area to the north, and personally moved his capital to the city of Orléans itself. Now, it's interesting to see, as well as we'll do for Gaul, but eventually with Spain, with Africa, etc., how properly the Alans somewhat impacted ethnically certain areas of Europe, right? So much that certain toponyms, as we will see, will probably be descended from the Alans, that spread also, properly the dog races, properly, that they used as great horsemen of the steppe to hunt, etc. These big animals. The Alans were pretty good beasts, and they left their mark in Europe. And under Goar, the Alans allied with the Burgundians, led by Gundaharius, right, with whom they installed the Emperor Jovinus also as an usurper. He was a Gallo-Roman senator, claimed to be a Roman emperor. That was also trying to establish, some kind of government in Gaul, in a parallel sense. These things, as you know, had already happened in the Roman Empire. At this point, it was, the Gaul was essentially, always more autonomous from any kind of Roman government. And under Gore's successor, Sanjiban, the Alans of Orleans played also a critical role in repelling the invasion of Attila the Hun, because they participated together with the Romans to the Battle of Chalon, of the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. And Alan cavalry distinguished in 463. Eventually, the Alans defeated the Goths at the Battle of Orleans itself. So this prevented the Visigoths to expand further north of Gaul, and eventually the Alans defeated also the Franks led by Childeric in 466. So checking also properly the early Merovingian expansion. In around 502, Clovis himself, Kingdom of Franks, attacked Armorica, but was defeated by the Alans. Right, so there is this state that is often overlooked, because we mostly think about Syagrius and then, defeated that, Gaul is free, is open. The Alans actually had something to say about that, because they were still there, right? But there were some broader interests, because at that point the Alans were Chalcedonian Christians like Clovis, so they were Nicene Orthodox Catholics, and they had a broader interest at that point to counterbalance the hostile Arian Visigoths that coveted the land north of the Loire. And this is before the Battle of Rouillé, which the Franks crushed the Goths and essentially reduced their presence in Gaul just to Septimani. So an agreement was arranged with Clovis that came to extend its control on some areas of Armorica that also quite escaped, actually, historically. Brittany fundamentally was not under French control up to the late Middle Ages, right? So they would always, as this Celtic reality, survive, but in this rough land, quite warlike in itself. But the broader, these Alans here fell, however, gradually within the Merovingian sphere of influence. So the Orleanais, etc., has this important Alan legacy. Also, I can imagine from some degree of, I don't know, about genetic studies, that they're quite foggy in general about these things. They don't absolutely render back the picture of the story. But it is to be considered that much of that, also that equestrian culture we talk about so much developing in France since Merovingian times, make videos about this all the time, had to do something with that as well, right? Like the Arthurian legions with the Sarmatian allies, venerating the swords in the stone and these mounts, sacred mounts, etc. It's all part of the broader Iranian military religious culture of the steppes that was revived in Europe from Proto-Indo-European times. Again, and the other chunk of the Alans that had left Spain are somewhat more famous, in spite of the also the fact they were absorbed as well, quite more brutally too, by other peoples. But also left important marks, in fact, in Iberia. The ones that followed the Vandals and the Suebi into the Iberian Peninsula. So we're talking about the era of Hispania, comprising modern Portugal and Spain. This happened in 409. The Alans, led by the king Respendal, settled in the provinces of the Lusitania and the Carthaginienses. And they established properly a dominion, a kingdom, if you want. It was also one of the first ones to be founded, because that's the same years in which the Visigoths were settling across the Pyrenees. It was after this big wave of the crossing of the Rhine, of the frozen Rhine, 406. Now, the Scythic Vandals settled in Baetica, so in the south, in far south of Spain, the richest area of Spain. The Suebi in coastal Galatia, so in the northwest, and the Asding Vandals in the rest of Galatia, in the hinterland. And although the newcomers controlled Hispania, they were still a tiny minority among a larger Hispano-Roman population. We're talking about 200,000 to 6 million, so 1 out of 30. And in 418 or 426, depending on the sources, because we also don't understand clearly what happened, because the situation now was pretty messed up in Spain, because these peoples had already settled without quite of a Roman permission. And they were all fragmented. I mean, these territorial realities were still incoherent, unstable, etc. So the Alan king Atatas was killed in battle against the Visigoths. Right, and this branch of the Alans subsequently appealed as to the Asding Vandal king Gunderic to accept the Alan crown, let's say, and thus the separate ethnic identity of Respendal's Alans dissolved, right, in the Vandal one. And albeit, as we will see now, some Alans remained in Iberia. Because also the territory was large. I mean, the penetration and settlement of these peoples was quite, as you understand, disorderly. Right? They would simply seize their own lordship. They would entrench into these local castle. They would form their own control. It's the same thing that the Germans did, because their kingship was still quite looser. Right? It took a lot to fix things into a more subtle direction. But most of the Alans went to North Africa with the Vandals in 429, right? And albeit we don't consider the Vandals much in this under this light, say okay, their kings in Africa styled themselves as Rex Vandalorum et Alanorum, so king of the Vandals and the Alans. And as you know, the Vandal kingdom is, there's been a stigma historiographically. The Vandals, in fact, the same term as destroyed, but as a matter of fact, there is no evidence, nor of much destruction, nor of much persecution. Actually, aside from the regular, military activity, there is none of this, and there was even a prosperity under this king that owed something surely to culturally to the Vandal legacy and these equestrian capacities as well. And, eventually the Vandal kingdom fell quite easily. But at the same time, it is the single most important kingdom in as much as it basically is the most direct cause of the end of the Western Roman Empire, because from Roman Africa, Tunisia was the granary of Italy at that point. They could in fact control the Italian policy, the local military capacity, etc. And especially Gaiseric was he stood his ground, right? Unlike other peoples like the Ostrogoths that basically surrendered to Majorianus, still showing, by the way, how non-deterministic the end of the West actually was. This people stood their ground, destroyed the Eastern Roman fleet, and managed to retain their independence until Justinian's reconquest. But at that time, the West was already, gone institutionally, etc. And there are some vestiges of the Alans in Portugal, right? There is this town of Alenquer that is thought to be a Germanic name for the Temple of the Alans, from Alan and Kirche. That's basically it. And there's a castle that may have been established by them. You don't know. There's mostly a legendary thing. But the Alant is still represented in that city's coat of arms, right? In the construction of castles of Torres Vedras and Almorol and the city walls of Lisbon were vestiges of their presence that may be found, for example, under the foundation of the Church of Santa Lucia, etc. So it's important that in areas that were not, especially those that were not dramatically populated, this is to be found also easily in Western Europe, like the ethnic impact was greater per being there less inhabitants and being sometimes also more military areas in a sense. And the Iberian Peninsula saw the Alan settlement in Lusitania and the Alentejo that we were talking about yesterday, just about medieval Portuguese history, and the Cartaginensis provinces. they, the Alans, as we were saying before, it was they were famous for defying running massive type dogs, the Åland, which apparently were introduced to Europe by them, right? And there is also a specific Spanish breed of dog called Alano in the local language that is used to in boar hunting. That is quite risky and violent business, and in cattle herding. So all things that resemble a bit that pastoral culture of the steppes. And the Alano name, however, has historically been used for a number of dog breeds, also in other countries in Europe. For example, the German Mastiff, the Great Dane, or the French Dog de Bordeaux may have come properly from the Åland dogs. We I don't think we know concretely, but so speaking, and as you understand, this is how basically the Ålands were, they simply mixed into the local populations in Western Europe, right? And some went probably alongside the same Ostrogoths in Italy. There was other bands settled here and there. I mean, surely in Britain, in Germany, wherever, in the Balkans, right? So speaking of medieval Alania instead, and therefore that political entity that we can identify clearly as properly the successor of the ancient Alans in the Caucasus area, well, this in fact was a fluctuating area, because as we were saying before, the Alans had originally settled a bit all in the north of the Caucasus, sometimes for hundreds of kilometers. Then on the shores of the Black and the Caspian Seas and so on. And throughout at this point, the 6th to 7th century, we are lucky that the Byzantine Empire recorded in the east some areas around. The Alans were always part of them in a sense, but we have a very few information about, especially these movements in the steppes where a mess happened. The Turks started to pour in, and in fact, the Alans at this point came into contact and conflict with the Bulgars, with the Gök Turks, and the Khazars, who actually drove most of them from the plains and into the mountains. As we were saying before, doesn't matter how warlike these people was, still others were coming, and they were it's mostly also a matter of demographic. I mean, all these Alans had fled west, and gone followed the fortunes, because those were the richest areas. These others would remain. They were probably less, and or had, as we've seen, fundamentally derived from a sort of retreat after the Germanic migration, etc. So they weren't much of a strong power on a regional scale as they had been before. So these other peoples basically pushed them towards the Caucasian foothills, where they established this kingdom that was quite important strategically, because fundamentally controlled some of the most important passes of the Caucasus, right? So into the Caucasian region to the north. Then it controlled the Kuban River. It was open to the Black Sea at some point. Also, as we will see, the Byzantines would give them a sort of fief on the coast at some point. So that's, as we were saying before, a history better told another time, probably about the Alan kingdom per se. What we know here is that their main enemies were the Khazars. Also, they, at the time of the Arab invasions, these people sided fundamentally with the Byzantines, albeit they. They were still pagan initially, but they would be in fact converted to Byzantine Orthodoxy since the beginning of the 10th century, right? This would be an international move to say, okay, we stick to that axis fundamentally, and they were in contact, however, with the Georgian principalities with whom they were allied, generally speaking, also with the Rus. There is proof of trade, of contact. There are Cyrillic inscriptions of their crosses, because these were nomadic peoples, right? They were illiterate. They were, but at this point they were kind of becoming ever more sedentary, but still in a rough, wild area. So there's not much civil output from which we can get the source, but we know that they interacted importantly. Even, there were international marriages. Even Alexander Nevsky's grandmother was Alan. There were lots of these connections, and in which the Alans appear always as warlike people, right? And whoever tried to venture in their own land, that they controlled the passes, they had quite a fierce resistance that came out kind of scorned from it. But still, they, as we know, Clausewitzianly speaking, whoever inhabits within the mountains, it's not much of a pop, because they they can be strategic important passage points, etc., but they are the less productive areas. That the fertile lands now were dominated by the Bulgars, by the Khazars, etc. So we also know that aside from the conversion under the Patriarchate of Nicholas I Mysticus, Al-Masudi reports that the Alans apostatized from Christianity in 932 after a military failure of the Byzantines. So the Muslims had overrun the Caucasian area, so the Alans were kind of keeping them at bay for along the Caucasus chain. And however, this back and forth from paganism to Christianity was short-lived, right? They would fundamentally remain Orthodox for a long time. They are collectively mentioned as Byzantine Rite Christians in the 13th century. The Caucasian Alans were the ancestors of the modern Ossetians, partially, right, whose ethnonym derives from the name As, as we were saying before, probably connected to the ancient Orsi. Al-Masudi mentions the Al-Arsiya as guards among the Khazars and the Rus, called the Alans Yazi, right, a sister tribe of the Alans. And this is particularly important because, as we will see, the Alans maintain their warlike character so much that as it always happens, their friends and enemies alike take their guards, them as guards, as bodyguards. And this is important because this is also a bit typical of the wildest areas, right, the least developed ones. It's like when the Romans hired the Germans. Why did they do it? Or the Arabs, the Turks, or here the Rus, the Khazars, because of course the more primitive the people, not just the more warlike in a sense. I mean, these were just guards. I mean, they as we've seen, they didn't have this overwhelmingly developed military or army or whatever, no, at all. But in terms of guardsmen physically, and here you have to think about tough selection, a tough lifestyle. They were habituated to rough things, but especially they were easy to buy, right? They had a ratio of individual military quality and let's say need of money. It was absolutely advantageous for whoever wanted to hire them, right? And being in this sense belonging to the semi-nomadic area peoples, etc., not having much broader connections, they were like they wouldn't have many other moves or interests or allegiance to, I don't know, which side or something. So they worked well as bodyguards. They were connected to the sovereigns, and that they were their only link in those places. They gave them the money, and that was pretty much it. But what is surprising is how many still the Alans were scattered all around, and how much they would provide for these bodyguards, right? Some let's say there are also other, broader, relatively to the Ossetian connection. I know the Armenian geography uses the name Ashtigor for the most westerly located Alans, a name which survives as Digor and still refers to the western divisions of the Ossetians, for example. In Ossetian, Asi refers to the region around the Mount Elbrus, where maybe the Alans had probably lived before, right? But in the migration era, some of the other Alans had remained under the rule of the Huns, that also, yes, get crushed in Europe. Also, they would throw the Romans keep hiring them, but they were always in the area north of Black Sea. We don't know what they were doing, right? They were always roaming around with these movements of peoples, etc. Europe had the Black Huns, the Sassanids got the White Huns, and there were always these people that in practice, as nomads would do always the same thing: raiding, harassing, coming back in their own steppe, heartland at some point. And those of the those islands went back in a sense with or along the Huns, etc., dispersed around about the steppes until late medieval times. We know that there were island communities here and there, and some of them would be pushed back again by that major wave that would be the Mongol conquest, right? So much that some possibly fled back again west into the Caucasus, where also a great part of the ethnogenesis of the Ossetian people might have happened, but as you understand, also with lots of other elements in the process and so on. The kingdom of Alania, as we've seen, had developed between the 9th and the 12th centuries, thus before the Mongol invasions, and it was, a relatively florid entity considering the times and places, right? And most islands submitted eventually to the Mongol Empire in 1239, 1277. Now, the Mongols, as you know, were these major waves that, submitted formally some areas, but they also needed to eventually root in some more, sedentary, rich, infrastructurally served reality, so that were major chunks, right? And the islands went along the Mongols at some point, participating in the invasion of Europe, and also the one of the Song dynasty in southern China. So you basically find them everywhere within the Mongol realm, back and forth, east and west. Islands participated under the Mamai of the Golden Horde at the Battle of Kulikovo, because at the end of the day, aside from the Ilkhanate, it was surely important from a cultural point of view in the area, but the islands would fall mostly in the Golden Horde orbit after the disgregation of the Mongol Empire. And there is all a list of Western historians. We made a video about that recently, about the travel chronicles, mostly discussing the Europeans in China during the 13th century, when the Pax Mongolica had opened all the trade routes, and lots of Europeans had always been in China, by the way, but at this point we're more, and we have a good documentation. Well, in 1253, the Franciscan monk William of Rubruck reported numerous Europeans in Central Asia, and it is known that 30,000 islands, it's a number that naturally has to be taken carefully, formed the royal guard, the Asud, of so this was their name, it was a military group of island origin, of the Yuan court in Dadu, that is Beijing. Right, and Marco Polo later reported their role in the Yuan dynasty in his book Il Milione. It is said that those islands contributed to a modern Mongol clan, even the Asud, while John of Montecorvino, Archbishop of Dadu, the Khan Balik, reported converted many islands to Roman Catholic Christianity, in addition to Armenians in China. Right, so these were there, and presumably also had remained fundamentally pagan. Naturally, here things had gone mixed. That there were lots of things going on in the steppe. Think about the Khazars that were at some point Jewish, right? These were, yes, there were still also, however, Muslims and Christians and pagans at the same time, right? And the islands also converted at some point in this different part of. And they roamed around, because you know that with the Golden Horde, eventually the expansion of, this channel of the steppes that always remained through the Ukraine, etc., and this fragmented reality of Eastern Europe, especially from the Russian side, brought to many islands also to flow west again. For example, in Poland and Lithuania, islands were part of the powerful clan of Ostoya. Right, it also owned important fortresses, had all an institutional role. So, for example, think about the Korasena or the Sarmatism of the Polish Szlachta. Right, this is not to be thought just ideally. Like literally, this nobility that managed the Commonwealth was often in contact in their contracting their armies, all these things with the with this eastern population of the Cossacks, but the Alans as well. In fact, that picture I inserted here with the Polish armor from the modern age, it's not just in fact anecdotal. The Alans also, like, even as modern events provided, like places like Ossetia, etc., they're not easy grounds, right? That's the reason why such peoples, not just the Alans, survived historically in the Caucasian foothills, and you couldn't really take them out. We know it, as we were saying before. Like, in the mountains are not much of aside from passage points, are not like profitably occupation land. They're just there, and these guys from there have limited resources, but they can't run in them, and you say, okay, they can't create some problems of infiltration, but who has the interest of going out there, making an enormous logistical effort for what? For a bunch of mountaineers. But this preserved them, right? Many occasions. And against the Alans and the Kumans, the Kipchaks, the Mongols used divide and conquer tactics, so obviously operating politically, as always, before the militarily, but first telling the Kumans to stop allying with the Alans, and after the Kumans followed their suggestion, the Mongols then attacked the Kumans and defeated the Alans at the same time. So this tells a bit, a bit of essential realpolitik. And Alans were recruited into the Mongol forces, as well as we've seen, one unit called the Right Alan Guard. Right, and you find these Alans, as we have seen, pretty much everywhere. The Huns used them, the Goths used them, the Romans used them, the Vandals used them, the Byzantines. The Byzantine, I don't know. Well, yeah, there were surely Alans in the Byzantine army, but it's not specifically a guard. But there were, like, at least the various blend, classic-sounding ethnographic generalizations of the Byzantines. There were surely Alans within them. The Rus, that also were the ones that actually provided, the terrible vengeance to the Byzantines. They used Alan guards themselves, and so on, and many other people, including the Mongols. So arguably, the greatest military machine the world has ever seen after the Roman Empire. So basically, here we're talking about some guys, and these troops were recruited variously. In the case of the Mongols on that occasion, by recently surrendered soldiers, which is a fascinating tactic, because at that point, as we were saying before, you have nothing to lose anymore. I can't kill you, but no, I hire you and give you a salary, and that's a good way of winning your faithfulness, right? There were colonies of them established in China together with other soldiers under the Mongol period. And the Alan and Kipchak guards were used by Kublai Khan himself. Naturally, they weren't the only ethnic element of the guards, bodyguards, but still. In 1368, at the end of the Yuan dynasty in China, Togan Temur was accompanied by his faithful Alan guards still. So you understand continuatively, in interest of time. So we're talking about realities that existed since the centuries before Christ. You find them, in spite of all these upheavals, still in the late Middle Ages, by in number, by serving in the best militaries around. At that point, also Mangu in the same dynasty enlisted in his bodyguard half of the troops of the Alan prince Arslan, whose younger son Nicholas took part in the expedition of the Mongols against Karayang in Yunnan. And this Alan Imperial Guard was still in existence in 1272, 1286, 1309, right? It was divided into two corps with headquarters in the Lingpei province, Karakorum. William of Rubruck, we mentioned before, this French-Flemish monk and traveler, mentions Alans numerous times in his account of his 1253-55 journey through Eurasia to the Great Khan. And Alans are registered living as Mongol subjects in Crimea, in Old Astrakhan, the Khan's capital Karakorum. So you understand, it stretched east and west still, and also still as freemen, however, in their Caucasian homeland. And William says, quote, "The Alans, or us, who are Christians and still fight the Tartars." This is fascinating because the eventually also Mongol powers in the area would become Muslim, etc. And the the core the land of Alania would exist as Christian as a Christian country in the meanwhile, in the storms of these populations. And these mentions continue on with some also ethnographic approximations saying these were Russian guards. Eventually, the Russians expanded in the area, etc. It's believed that some Alans resettled to the north in Barcilis, merging with the Volga Bulgars that also were quite a resilient people far north, that were eventually absorbed by trying to escape the Rus, the Mongol attacks, etc. And also Burtas, right? That we're talking about peoples that have an uncertain ethno-linguistic affiliation, but they were, as you understand, the steppes kind of more or less all mixed, and eventually they would transform into the Volga Tatars in that specific case. Okay, there will be many considerations to make, but a bit too complicated now. It's supposed there are legions, like for example, suppose that Yazi, that as we've seen take the name of the Alans in a sense, was founded by the Alans themselves in northeast Romania around 1200, 1300 near the Prut River, and this would become the capital of ancient Moldavia in the Middle Ages, right? And Alan mercenaries were involved also in the affair with the Catalan company. That is to say, when Roger de Flor, we made a bit about him, arrived in the early 14th century in Asia Minor, there were Alans there that also created problems and so on. So that they are fascinating people. Descendants of the Alans live today in the autonomous republics of Russia and Georgia. They speak the Ossetian language, which belongs to, as we've seen, this northeastern Iranian language group, right? And they are basically some of the last northwesternmost Iranian-speaking people in the area emanating from the Middle East and Caucasus and so on. And it's thought that they are the only remnant of the Scytho-Sarmatian dialect continuum, right? That once was spread over much of the Pontic steppe and Central Asia, even. So they are really a museum people from a cultural point of view. And modern Ossetians have two major dialects. One said before is the Digur, that is spoken in the western part of north of Ossetia, and Iran is spoken in the rest of the country. And a third branch of Ossetian, the Yasik Yash, was also formerly spoken in Hungary because somebody had remained there. Think about all these peoples, the Goths that had passed by. Later on, the same Turkic people surely brought some Alan with them. In the process, in the Avars did, even the Ugrophanes did at some point. And the literary language based on the Iron dialect is also part of the Ossetian national literature by in the work of Kosta Ketagurov in living between the 19th and the 20th century. I mean, genetically speaking, there is an understanding that there may be some important continuity with properly the very ancient Alans among the Ossetians, albeit, as we were saying before, we're talking mostly of, and this is to be seen because we can trace a genetic background that are very similar within the same, within a portion of the same population. So this may have to do with, some peoples that lived for a long time together and share this characteristic that naturally can come through other dynamics. Then we see other groups that may be properly the largest one, the second largest one, that may be properly the Caucasian Alanized people that naturally we're not talking just about Alans. So the continuity is fascinating, but at the same time we have to be realistic, as for many other peoples that they changed name, face, language for obvious reasons, especially in these very unstable areas. But still, you find some continuities too that are important to be regarded at the same time. So for today I conclude here. It was very interesting. Like, we will talk about the islands, of course, frequently, especially in our medieval knighthood series that deals, in fact, with their mostly technical, metallurgic impact, also properly in the early medieval European military culture, and all what we can trace ideally from this. These peoples that spread terror at some point in the steppe from the top of their equestrian military capacity, and that represented for the observers of the time as the finest cavalry around, right? So let's never forget in these continuities that we have seen in Gaul, in Britain, in Spain, in Italy, in Africa, and so on, and beyond, more and more, in the same Germany, in the same Balkans, basically everywhere. It's difficult to find an area where they wouldn't settle. Mostly the ones properly directly controlled by the Byzantines, that also, however, settled lots of these peoples in a more mediated way, but still, as we were saying before, with the Orleanese names, or the Alenteos we were saying before, this horse breeds are quite fascinating. The relics of other peoples that had absorbed the islands themselves. Think about the Ostrogoths, eventually settled and remained in Italy, and so on. And so lots of different brooklets, as you see, that of a single people that, however, remained remarkably numerous, at least, and ethnically identifiable for an extremely long time, until fundamentally the modern age, and since centuries before Christ. And this is a really a big deal, because it is an exception. There's hardly anything like this in interest of time with such continuity, and that's why this people really deserves a lot of attention. I want to thank the user who asked me, if it was possible to make a video about the islands. Yes, I did this video exactly on his advice, and so I thank him, because it was interesting. I learned some things myself that I didn't know before, and so that's it. And for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.